Hi there, I'm Christine Zips, health rights advocate and founder of Wired Schools and Zips Media. Today, our guests are Alex Newman and Dr. Duke Pesta. We'll be venturing into what all is going on in public schools. And there's so much that is going on, as I understand, that even parents aren't aware of, and we believe they should be aware of, obviously. So thank you so much. And I'd like to start with the introductions of our speakers. And Dr. Duke Pesta is the director of Freedom Project Academy, host of the Dr. Duke Show podcast, a tenured professor of English at the University of Washington, Oshkosh, and the academic director of Freedom Project Education. Dr. Pesta received his MA in Renaissance Literature from John Carroll University and his PhD in Shakespeare and Renaissance Literature from Purdue University. Alex Newman is an award-winning journalist, international correspondent, educator, author, and consultant. In addition to serving as a writer and media personality for Freedom Project, Alex is foreign correspondent for the New American Magazine, contributor to WorldNet Daily, and president of the media and information consulting firm Liberty Sentinel Media. And to start off, I'd like to, first of all, welcome to you both. I know you're so used to working together. I'm sure this will be comfortable for you guys.
Great to be here. Thanks for having us, Christine.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Our pleasure, absolutely. So I would, just to get things rolling, to kind of set the mood, I'd like to start with this quote from the 1800s by Johann Gottlieb Fichte. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Education should aim at destroying free will so that after pupils are thus schooled, they will be incapable throughout the rest of their lives of thinking and acting otherwise than as their schoolmasters would have wished. So I, was thinking that this might be a new thing, that schools are kind of going downhill, but it appears as though they have been degrading over the last while now. And I believe kind of going a little bit faster, but we'll be talking about that more. But I'd like to start off with you, Dr. Duke. Would you say that parents who believe that, the sentiment, in the ideal world, parents should be able to trust that when they drop off their children at school, that they're in a safe environment and they're there to learn reading, writing, and arithmetic? So Dr. Duke, do you say that parents who believe this have been lulled into a false sense of security?
Oh, absolutely. That's the biggest problem we have right now. I mean, somewhere along the line, it didn't start with Common Core, although Common Core was really the turning point, I think, in transferring most of the control of education away from the states and up to the federal government. Certainly in the last 5 to 7 years, the public school system has decided on their own, without consulting parents, without consulting outside educators, without consulting governors or legislatures, the educrats that run public schools have decided that the primary purpose of education isn't ABCs and 1, 2, 3s anymore. And yet the vast majority of moms and dads, I'd say probably 95% of moms and dads who are sending their kids to the schools, public schools, think they're doing it to get the kids math, reading, literacy. They're not. And one of the most stunning aspects of American culture in the last 150 years, I think, is this, that over a series of years, under the guise of radical change, under things like Common Core and how we're going to approach education, this huge aspect of American culture, this incredibly expensive part of our yearly expenditure, educating our children in public schools, has been transformed. Now they're primarily into social change. What Fichte, the educator reformer Fichte, who you quoted, that's exactly this, right? The purpose of education now is to make children progressive. And how do you do that? Well, you give them a one-sided political education. You bring very hot button progressive issues like transgenderism, radical sexualization, all that stuff that we're seeing in the schools now. You bring them in at younger and younger ages. And what you're really doing is breaking children down. And the last part of it I would throw out here in the early part of the discussion, very alarming over the last 2 or 3 years, is the way now that teachers and educrats believe they are the primary caregivers of your kids, that they have a more of a right to be the parent when it comes to sociological, psychological, sexual. Just think about social and emotional learning. I don't know why moms and dads don't freak out when they hear that term, because think about what they're telling you. They're looking you in the eye and they say, hey, we're not really going to teach for academic achievement. We're not going to teach for academic excellence anymore. We're going to teach to your child's social and emotional welfare. And I would simply say, I've been around teachers with 4-year degrees my whole life. There is not one of them who's qualified to be your kid's psychiatrist, psychologist, and God help us, your kid's sociologist. If you're going to turn the schools into places of sociology and social emotional learning, fire every union teacher right now and replace them with psychologists, because you have no qualification to do that to our kids.
But I'd like to pose a question to both of you. What would you say are the top 3 important issues that parents should know about today? I know you've just discussed this main one, Dr. Duke, which is great, but any other ones? There's so many. I've been doing a deep dive, but
I'll give you my 3 real quick, and then I'll let Alex weigh in here.
Very good.
And the 3 biggest issues that I have right now is, again, the willful displacement of parents. Parents are the public stakeholders. Parents are footing the bill for most of this public education. Now they're being cut out. That's number 1. Number 2, the radical sexualization, and I'm talking for everything from transgenderism to teaching kids how to engage in sex acts at young ages. All of this aids in the destruction of the relationship between the parents and the kids, but it also breaks kids down morally so they can be reconstructed along progressive lines. And then the third thing that I would say is this rejection of academic excellence in the name of critical race theory. What we've been told now, the reason all kids aren't brilliant and the reason all kids don't get A's is because of racism. If it weren't for racism, then all kids would get the same grades. And so we're going to get rid of education, literally get rid of education, until all kids get the same grades. And by doing that, the only way to do that, we know, is to don't have tests, don't measure, don't actually ask kids to study. The only way you're going to get 60 million American school kids to the same level of education is if you don't educate them at all. And that's where we are.
Thank you. Alex, you have the floor there. The top.
I'd say the top 3 issues, as far as I'm concerned. Number 1 is parents need to understand your children are being destroyed. And I mean that quite literally. Your children are being destroyed mentally and physically and emotionally and academically and spiritually. They are being destroyed. They're being weaponized against you. They're being weaponized against their country. They're being weaponized against our civilization and our country, our Constitution, our churches, basically everything we hold dear. And increasingly, there's only a tiny, tiny handful who manage to slip through the cracks. And those are typically the kids who don't pay any attention in school, the kids who are coming to class, under the influence. And they're just so out of it. They're so uninterested in the brainwashing that fortunately, it just kind of goes right off them like water off of a duck's back. But for the majority, when the parents are sending them there and telling them, listen to your teachers, do what they say, those kids are being destroyed in every way. And the data shows that very clearly. It's now at the point where government schools are taking them to have so-called sex changes. They're pumping them full of hormones without their parents realizing. They're getting them prepared for sex change surgeries. They are dumber than kids have ever been in our entire history by a significant margin. They are psychologically conditioned, very much like circus animals are psychologically conditioned to display certain responses, to exhibit certain preconditioned responses to various stimuli. I can't overemphasize the danger of this. The next most important thing that I would point out is that this was the plan all along. There never was this golden era of government brainwashing, government schooling, where suddenly everything was wonderful. And then there was just this time in history when everything went wrong. The plan of the people who created the government school system. There were some useful idiots there who, of course, didn't realize what they were doing. But at the highest levels, the John Deweys of the world, the Horace Manns of the world, the Robert Owens of the world, the people who created this abomination that we call public school system, fully intended from the very beginning to turn these children against God, to turn them against their families, and to turn them against the liberties that we at least used to enjoy here in this country, and less and less so, unfortunately. And then finally, the last of the most important 3 things I would say is there's only one solution to this. That is to get your children out of the indoctrination camps on a massive scale. The solution for the individual child is to get out. The solution on a society-wide macro scale is to completely smash and obliterate the system and start again from scratch. We need a non-system. We need to make sure that this kind of power is never again in the hands of anyone, right? There's never a situation where it's okay to have the minds of 70 million children in the hands of a tiny group of psychopathic elites. And even if you think, well, what if we get good people to run the system? Okay, what if we get good people for 2 years? Maniacs, psychopaths, criminals, perverts will get charge of the system again, and we'll be right back where we started. So we need to make sure that this kind of situation isn't even possible because these tools don't exist in the first place. It's very much like imagine a weapon that could destroy the universe, right? The last thing in the world we would want is to actually build that weapon because somebody would get their hands on it and destroy the universe. So a much better solution is to just make sure that that kind of weapon system doesn't exist. And even just for that reason alone, even if you like what's going on in the public school system today, which I think you'd be a tiny ultra fringe minority. Even the liberals have now recognized this whole thing is a fiasco. It's a disaster. They may not realize how bad it is, but they recognize that this is not acceptable. The solution is just to make sure that something like this never grows up again and never can grow up again. We need a decentralized system, primarily free market, dominated by churches and private companies and charities and tutors and private academies like the Freedom Project Academy. This will have competition. It'll make sure that there is no way for one person or one small group of people to get their hands on the minds of all of our children. And so those are the three things that I would emphasize, in my view, are the most important.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. I would agree totally. And I understand that children have been removed from schools a great deal. And like they get their funding from how many butts they have and how many chairs. So, and there's more and more homeschooling options and resources coming online, which I find very encouraging. But would you say that it's probably even strange to even ask the question, but do you think our current government school system is beyond redemption in the way it's set up? Do we need a massive rehaul, like just totally revamp everything? Or do they just need to be shut down across the board, never to come back again?
I mean, if you look at what they're doing, the answer has to be they must be shut down. What are they doing? As we said a moment ago, and Alex just said, they're not interested in educating kids. What you and I and most of the moms out there see as education, literacy, intellectual pursuits, mastery of subject, cultural literacy, historical literacy, that's not what they're in this for. They are, just take one example in history. They're adopting, as soon as they can get their hands on it, the 1619 curriculum. Everybody knows, including the author, and including a whole skew of liberal historians, know it's garbage. It's not factual. It's not true. The entire thing it's built on faulty assumptions. The woman who actually created it has no academic degree. She's not a historian. And yet our public schools are taking it. Why? Because the ideology is correct if the history is wrong. The ideology of the public schools is that they were founded in white supremacist, just like the Constitution. This is the irony, right? We got a public school system in the 1850s, right? It's a long time ago. And here's the irony. For up until the last 150 years, all you would hear from liberals is how wonderful it was, right? Mm-hmm. How wonderful, how progressive it was, how our kids were getting all this stuff. Now comes Black Lives Matter. Now comes critical race theory. 2 years later, our entire public school system, this is lefties talking now, our entire public school system is irremediably racist, systemically racist, period. They're telling you this. Now, what Alex said is, and I want to reiterate that, if that's what they really believe, this is where the hypocrisy of the left is. If they really believe that the history of American education is systemically racist, then they should be on our side, right? March with us, you progressives, and let's get rid of public education once and for all. But they don't. And what they see instead is they're taking advantage of what they call broken school, racist schools to transform education away from actual knowledge, because knowledge is hard. knowledge and success doesn't come easy. There are a lot of kids that aren't going to do as well as other kids in certain subjects. And there are, God help us, some kids who'll never get much of an education, no matter what you do. This is the fact on the ground. But the public schools have decided now, up until now, Black and minority kids don't do well because of racism. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to make the public schools nothing more than equity shops. Everything that was held against minorities. What we're starting from the perspective that Black and brown kids can't learn, not because there's anything wrong with them, but because there's everything wrong with our schools and racism. So if you've got to artificially hold down kids, if you've got to socially promote kids who don't know how, even kids who can't read, there's a horrible, and Alex covered the story as well from Baltimore. We had one high school in Baltimore, inner city high school, that had about 650 seniors, and less than 1.2% could read at a senior level in high school. But about 150 were reading at kindergarten, first and second grade levels. I mean, let's be very clear. When your high school senior is reading at a first grade level, a kindergarten level, he's not reading at all. Kids at kindergarten don't read. First graders don't read. And so when you've got 250 kids reading at that level and only 1.2 reading at senior at high school, this is the new model, right? So rather than burn it to the ground, the liberals, here's the irony again, to circle back. Progressives hate the American public school as much as we do. We hate it because it's not a school anymore. It's a place where parents are being frozen out, kids are being separated from parents, and they're being fed a dangerous, godless worldview. Liberals hate it because of the history of racism. So notice what their response is. We're going to keep doing it, but we're going to make it all about sociology because that's equity. And where we're saying, get your kids out of there. So there's a lot of strange bedfellows and a lot of absolute hypocrisy when you think about how the left has handled this. Last comment, if public schools for the last 70 years and more, actually, but predominantly for the last 70 years, certainly since post-World War II, public schools have been dominated exclusively by left-wing militant progressives. They own every aspect of it, from pre-K all the way to graduate school. It's been a liberal progressive undertaking. And when you look at the level of failure over those 7 years, I can't think of another aspect of American culture where teachers can fail as bad as our teachers have failed, where the school system has collapsed in terms of being able to give our kids an education of ABCs and 1, 2, 3s. And yet, can you name another broken system that keeps getting funded? I mean, the reward for failure is raises. The reward for failure is referendas, more money coming in, teachers unions wallowing in money. So yeah, that's a big problem across the board.
And it sounds like that. Thank you again for sharing all of that. And it's just such a dismal outlook. And I understand that they're like lowering or reducing everything to the lowest common denominator, that in some schools they're removing the valedictorian, and children are being discouraged for excelling. If they're creative, if they're aspiring, then they get dampened down. Don't make waves, don't make others look bad. And that is so unhealthy.
Talk about how under critical race theory, under the new schools, not only are they getting rid of subject matter in the name of sociology, but they're actually bringing racism back in our public schools. Discuss, if you could share that with everybody.
Sure. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. I actually wrote a very in-depth cover story for the New American Magazine about critical race theory and why it was being put into the schools. I think it needs to be understood as essentially the same, almost exactly the same type of operation that Chairman Mao used in China. Now, you substitute race for class in China and in other places where communism has taken root. But the goal was to create a fault line in the society that could then be exploited by the revolutionaries for the purpose of overthrowing the existing structure and rebuilding something new in its place. So in communist China, Chairman Mao divided up the population, especially the children, into the black classes and into the red classes. The black classes were, by definition, the evil classes. You were born into a black class. There was nothing you could do to remove the stain of your blackness from you. You still had to do public self-criticism. You had to stand up in front of the classroom and acknowledge how horrible, what a terrible person you were, because your parents might have been business owners or they might have owned a little bit of land. They may have excelled in some way. They may have been Christians. They may have opposed the communist Revolution. And so children were turned against their parents. They were turned against their nation's history. They were turned against everything that existed prior, and were told that it was evil. And no matter how much repenting they did, they still could not remove that stain. The red classes, by contrast, were the good classes. These were the landless peasants, the working class, the revolutionary soldiers, the Red Guards, etc. And these were the good ones. And so they were in charge. They were considered to be the oppressed victims. And now the revolution had freed them. And so this, in the American context, had to look a little bit different. It wasn't feasible to try to market that idea to Americans, because it was so self-evidently ludicrous, right? Our so-called poor people in America, they have an average of 2 cars in the driveway. They've got 4-color TVs. They've got air conditioning. They've got all the food in the world. Many of them are obese. I mean, the idea that the poor in America are really poor, it wasn't working. The idea that they were going to be oppressed by their employers, it just wasn't realistic. So they came up with these new possible fault lines. Race was, of course, the primary one. And they actually figured this out back in the 1930s, a meeting of the Comintern. They said, hey, let's exploit the racial issue in America. That'll be much more effective than the class issue. And they began back in the 1930s. And now that's culminated in this indoctrination in the schools, where they're telling little children, oh, well, your skin, your ancestors came from Europe. Your skin doesn't have all that much melanin in it. Therefore, you are an oppressor by definition. You're one of the bad classes. You're part of the bad class. And then the other children, oh, well, your ancestors came from Africa or Asia or Latin America or whatever it is. Therefore, you are part of the oppressed group, and you guys are always and everywhere in conflict with each other. They've recently added one more out for children of European heritage. They tell them, well, if you're a homosexual or if you identify as a non-binary or a pangender or whatever, crazy gender idea, then you can also be part of the oppressed classes. And, that way you don't have to be the evil oppressor. And what little kid wants to be the evil oppressor? Right? We're talking 6, 7, 8-year-old children. The idea that they're oppressing their schoolmates is horrifying to them. So they'll do anything to get out of this. And presto, you've now created this fault line. You just label everything that you don't like about society, every institution, every cultural element as white supremacy. And therefore, it can't be defended, because anyone who defends it is automatically defending white supremacy, or a white supremacist is one of the oppressors. And so you've created a recipe here for the controlled demolition of the existing society, the existing constitution, the existing system of government, the existing civilization, and its replacement with something much more monstrous. Now, if you go back in the history of the public schools, what you'll find is that every single one of the key people had this dream of using the public school system to bring about a communist utopia, a collectivist world, going clear back to Robert Owen, the guy who really got the movement kicked off in America, who set up a secret society to promote these ideas back when the idea that the government would educate our children sounded preposterous to the vast majority of Americans. And his goal was always to use the school system through the government to indoctrinate children away from private property, away from God, away from biblical ideals, and into this communist utopian system. Well, the most successful iteration of this idea that the government school should be used to fundamentally transform society, I think, is the one we're currently witnessing. It's not new. It's only recently that parents have discovered it, though. But what they've done, they've already turned an entire generation of American young people against their own country. A poll just came out recently that said only 55% of Americans would even stay and fight if America was invaded. Almost 40% would flee. They would try to go to another country. So that tells you how badly they have turned our young people against our country. Your average young American, including my generation, millennials, believes that America is horrible. It's not worth fighting for. It should be destroyed, and something new should be built in its place. And if you actually drill down, well, what do you think should be built in its place? What you'll find is these people are hoping to build a totalitarian society, not because they have any experience with totalitarianism, not because totalitarianism would be fun, but because they've been conditioned, they've been programmed to regurgitate these talking points. And if we don't deal with this crisis, that's what we're headed into.
That is staggering. I hadn't heard it quite that way, Alex. And, as far as, are they not attaching government to, are they teaching them to hate America or to question government?
There's another poll that came out recently. The age between 18 and 25, that college age, 3 out of 4, 75% of people in that age group would transform America to a socialist country immediately if they had the power to do so. And just to take what Alex said a little further, they're doing this in the classroom. They are actually, think about it, the last aspect of civil rights that had to be initiated to make us a country of opportunity for all was segregation. Jim Crow had been killed for quite a while. Actual legal discrimination was harder and harder and much less likely to occur. But the one thing that you had was segregation, segregated lunch counters, segregated buses. This was the last hateful aspect of racism that was finally addressed in the 1964 civil rights legislation. Last year alone, there were over 100 universities in this country that had segregated graduations, where Blacks and Hispanics and gay and LGBT were allowed to have separate graduation systems. Right now on college campuses, they're building dormitories just for minorities to live in, not white people. There's this idea that the progressive left is what Alex was saying. They're now taking the lessons, the evil lessons of racism, and they're resurrecting them, and they're using them against your kids. The little black and brown skinned kids in your schools are being told that they should not even try academically because they are at a huge disadvantage, and it's all the fault of the little white kid sitting next to them. So they'll watch while we hold down those white kids and we excuse the minority kids from trying. And then we give everybody the perks of diplomas and college entries. And so segregation and actual racism. We had a situation, a school in Kentucky, North Carolina, where the teacher took every student in the class and lined them up from lightest to darkest. Now, how does a progressive liberal teacher even know how to do that? A white woman, how does she even know to do that? Who's the whitest and who's the blackest? Anyway, we set them up from the whitest to the blackest, and one by one, the whitest had to turn to the black one, the blacker one behind him, and apologize for everything. I mean, so these kids, this is a 5th grade class, right? Where kids as young as 11 or 12 were actually apologizing for all the evils of the world, which their skin color made them support. And so this kind of stuff. So Alex gave a great overview about how this happened. I just wanted to put that little punctuation is that they're not critical race theory is not fighting racism. It is reestablishing it. Ibrahim Kendi, one of the founding philosophers, he's a 2-bit academic who wrote a couple of books on this stuff. But one of his most famous quotes was, discrimination yesterday, discrimination today, discrimination forever. His argument is the only way there will be liberation and equality is if Blacks and other minorities become as racist as white people have been ever since they were created, according to the narrative.
Oh my gosh, just when I thought it couldn't get any worse. That is amazing. And is it true, do you know that in schools, back when I was in school in the dark ages, parents could sit in on classes at any time if they wanted. Come on into the school. Yeah, I'm just curious. I want to see what's going on in my daughter's science class.
I know, Alex, you could talk. I want to ask you, Alex, to talk about all of this body mutation, all this ways that we're biologically tracing our kids' behavior. Real quick before I do that, just remember this before I turn this over to Alex. 12 years ago, right before Common Core hit, the public schools were begging parents to help. 12, 15 years ago, the public schools were saying, hey, please help us get your kids to school, get your kids, make sure you eat breakfast, make your kids sure you're doing their homework. Then came Common Core just 10 years ago. And then the same public teachers told us, stay out of the schools, stay out of the homework. It's too hard. It's too sophisticated for you. And now, under critical race theory, our teachers, our parents are being reported to the federal government for showing up at school board meetings, and they're being designated domestic terrorists by the FBI. All this in 13 years. And tell us about all the devices, Alex, that the public schools use to biologically measure human performance in the schools.
Well, it is really a terrifying picture. It's beyond what Orwell could have even imagined. And we've got reports going back almost a decade from the U.S. Department of Education on some of this technology that they're using, that they're funding. They've got facial expression cameras that monitor the facial expressions that students make in response to various stimuli, and then determine whether that child needs an intervention if he or she displays the incorrect response to the stimuli. And this was in reports, like I said, almost a decade ago from the U.S. Department of Education. Now there's actually an American company that's been working with Communist China to put brainwave monitors on children that feeds real-time data to the teacher, to the parents, to the government school to determine, first of all, whether the child's paying attention, whether he or she is concentrating. And what's happening in China is really the model for what's going to happen all over the world. You add to that, they've got RFID tags. They're now taking children's thumbprints to be able to get their lunch. This is conditioning to live as a slave in a concentration camp style society. The bell rings, you move to the next station, you give your thumbprint so that you can get your nutrition, your sustenance. Bell rings, you move to the next station, you get washed up. Bell rings, you move to the next station, you get a psychological examination to determine whether you need to be medicated if you're uncomfortable with what's going on. I mean, it sounds like a bad science fiction movie, and yet this is exactly what our children are being groomed to prepare for. The book Brave New World. A lot of people don't realize the Huxley brothers, Aldous Huxley and his brother Julian Huxley. This was not like a warning, like, hey, look what could happen. These people were actually plotting this. Aldous Huxley's brother, Julian Huxley, was the first head of UNESCO, the UN's Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. And he also was the head of the Eugenics Society. So they believed very much in these pseudo-scientific notions of improving the humanity through selective breeding and through getting certain genetics out of the gene pool. And he also was the head of the Humanist Society. Now, some of the things that we read about in Brave New World, this idea of total promiscuity, right? Total birth control. Nobody's allowed to have children. The government determines when children are being born. This is the kind of world that our children are being prepared to enter. And anything outside of that they're being conditioned to believe is racist, patriarchal, oppressive, all the terms that they're supposed to salivate when they hear. And so they are being prepared not just to live in a totalitarian society, they're being prepared to build a totalitarian society and to fight to the death anybody who resists that totalitarian society. So we need to understand that the combination of technology and indoctrination and behavioral psychology, this is a weapon more powerful than anything that's ever been deployed. It makes a nuclear bomb look ridiculous and small by comparison. And if this weapon is not stopped before it finishes off our children, the prospects of liberty or Christian civilization moving on into the future drop to virtually nil without some sort of divine intervention.